Welcome to the Cloud Pod, where the forecast is always cloudy. We talk weekly about all things AWS, GCP, and Azure. We are your hosts,
Justin,
Jonathan,
Ryan,
and Peter.
Episode 206, recorded for March 29th, 2023. The TCP podcast ponders Security Copilot or Vaporware. You decide. Good evening, Jonathan and Ryan, and we have a guest tonight, Matt Kohn. How's it going, Matt?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Good. It's been a bit. It's been a hot minute since you've been on the show. I think maybe a year and a half, something like that.
That seems about right.
It was pre-baby, so I mean, everything is a time warp after baby. So it's hard to recall now.
Yeah, it's been a long year, but a good year, so I can't complain too much.
The best of times and the worst of times, parenthood.
Remember how old you are now, because you'll be forever that old. I stopped counting as soon as I had kids. It's like, okay.
Yeah, mine are turning 14 and 12 this year, and I don't know how it's possible because I haven't aged a day since they were born. So, Yep, perfect. Well, we have news as always, and the thing about Matt here now is I sort of set him up because I knew we wanted him to be on the show more often. And so then my CTO friend called and was like, hey, I've got a gig for a cloud person. Are you interested? And I said, well, what cloud are you going to? And she said, Azure. And I said, well, hell no, I don't want to do that. But I said, but I know a guy who's looking for work. And that was Matt. And Matt is now joined her and now is an Azure expert. So it's a whole new perspective that you can bring to the podcast tonight, that you're an Azure expert and can tell us all the amazingness of Azure. Because all of us have all sworn off Azure. So like we've taken the bridge too far to GCP from AWS and are suffering our consequences. And so we're learning our things, but you're on the other side. And so it's an interesting perspective that we've never really had as someone who actually used Azure in production every day of their lives for the last.
See, you've sworn off. I've sworn at Azure daily, so it's a slightly different perspective. No, it's definitely a big transition because a lot of the key things that you just expect to be there after 8 years and helping Amazon write their exams and knowing the ins and outs and limits of it are just not there, or are completely different fundamentals that you have to kind of rebuild. But the nice thing about it is all the same core concepts still apply. So, making sure things are highly available in multiple zones and multi-region DR, and making sure that, all those fundamental key concepts of how you build your pipelines and everything to deliver in a truly, CI/CD fashion are all still the same. So same thing, new tools. Get to learn something new.
Keep telling yourself that.
It's the only way I get through it every day.
That's how we get through GCP every day too. So. There's gotta be positive things, right? Like I'll find them someday. I haven't found it quite yet. Servers, not so much.
I will say the actual, Microsoft technologies do work extremely well there. So, running Microsoft SQL Server, they've done a really good job and keep it really up to date and keep it running very optimally. And they do things that Amazon can't do. Like you can essentially over provision stuff, in the same way you did with, Kubernetes, loading more compute than you actually have, or with VMware and your on-prem virtual machines overloading it. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. So it does make sense. If you are a very heavy Microsoft stack, you can get away a lot with, a couple of extra things that Microsoft can do because they, own the whole product lifecycle for it.
I'll take your word for it. I mean, I have Azure too, but I try not to ask too many questions because it just makes me raise my eyebrows.
You're better off. You're better off. I'm trying to be positive here.
Yeah. That's a different team. I mean, they're my team, but they're still a different team, and they're in the UK, so I don't hear their complaints as much as I hear the GCP ones. So it's one of those things. All right, well, let's get into it. Terraform Enterprise has several updates this week from HashiCorp. They have been rapidly innovating on their cloud version of Terraform, and so it's nice to see those things finally make it back into the Terraform Enterprise for those of you who were fooled into paying bajillions of dollars to HashiCorp. So some of the new features for you is a fresh new UI that's not so fresh if you use the cloud version because it's just a copy of that, released using the Helios design system. They have a new cross-organizational provider, which sharing allows you to share via private registry across the organization, just as you could with a module. There's a new abstraction layer called projects, allowing you to organize and manage groups of related workspaces within Terraform Enterprise organizations. Projects allow an admin to create logical ownership boundaries and enable teams to safely manage their workspace. GitHub App Auth provides an enhanced integration between Terraform Enterprise and GitHub.com and GitHub Enterprise instances. And unlike the OAuth-based Auth, which used a single highly privileged service account, the GitHub app operates using it under its own identity while also applying permissions of individual users when interacting with repos, which is really good. There's a new improved run pipeline model known as the TFE Taskworker, which is based on the TFC agent runtime. This allows Terraform Enterprise to deliver highly anticipated features such as OPA support, dynamic provider credentials, and drift detection. And OPA support is exactly what you thought. They're getting rid of Sentinel. No, they're not. They're give you OPA and Sentinel, so you can use either or both of them. The dynamic provider support allows the Auth model to leverage the OpenID Connect to generate short-lived credentials to your Terraform runs, eliminating the risk of inherent static long-lived credentials, which is super cool. And drift detection, allowing you to track deviations for your Terraform code and what those people did in ClickOps to mess up your code. So there you go. That's all in Terraform Enterprise now, apparently.
Yeah, I'm surprised how long drift detection took to make it from cloud to the enterprise product, just because I was still using the enterprise product when that was announced for cloud use. And, it was months and months and months and months, if not years later. So it's, I guess that's always sort of the challenge when using, an enterprise product. It's going to be slow, and you're going to have to wait a long time for features that you really want.
What's the difference between drift detection and just running a plan and seeing what's going to change?
That is what their drift detection is.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. It just runs every so often and yells at you when there's someone's done something.
So it's an automatic plan, basically. Okay.
Pretty much.
The reality is that if you are a SaaS company that decided they want to have an enterprise on-premise product, the paths that now diverge from continuous delivery and continuous integration to support an on-premise thing, it's actually a very complicated use case. I've worked at a couple of companies that did it. I've known several people in the industry who do that as part of and it's like a whole team of dedicated people who just, their job is to take the SaaS version once a year and turn it into a on-prem product, and rip out all of the special sauce and all of the uniqueness and make it into something consumable. And it's actually a pretty complicated lift in many organizations. So it's not surprised to see that the Terraform Enterprise roadmap has kind of slowed down in comparison to the cloud because they get real-time feedback there. So that doesn't surprise me, actually, as much as maybe it surprised you.
Well, and just like anything, enterprise customers are slow to, roll out changes and update, right? So it can be tricky to offer these things quickly and then cause problems for those enterprise customers. Whereas if you're managing it as part of your platform, you can do much more. You can feature flag and do canary deployments, and you have a lot more control over some of these things.
Especially when you can guinea pig all your customers with your cloud version. So, All right, let's move on to AWS. AWS had a couple of things this week. We talked about a few weeks ago on our cloud migration journey episode about all the tools about the AWS application migration service. And they've added 3 new features this week that'll help you move your workloads in a more less time intensive way, less error prone, and more automated. So first up is the feature import and export. You can use App Migration Service to import your source environment inventory list to the service from a CSV file. Ooh. You can also export your source server inventory for reporting purposes, offline reviews and updates, and integration with other tools and AWS services, and perform bulk configuration changes by re-importing the inventory list, which is a great way to mess up your entire environment. Server Migration Metrics Dashboard. This new dashboard can help simplify migration project management by providing an aggregated view of the migration lifecycle status, as well as additional post-launch modernization actions. With this update, Application Migration Service added 8 additional predefined post-launch actions, things like convert your SQL license from this type of license to Amazon licensing, or other types of things that you may want to do in the cloud.
I feel like the post-launch migration action items are always really good and then always get ignored because you've successfully moved and no one cares about anything else for at least 2 years until they look at their bill and go, oh God, we moved and we forgot to do all these post-action items. And why is our bill so expensive now?
Yeah, migration projects are never measured, past that getting into the cloud, right? So it's always like, there's your success metric, and then moving on to something new because you've been doing this migration for 3 years. I would like to see like some of the internals on like some of those things, like replacing the licenses. Is that, done at the OS layer? Is it automated, or is it like prepackaged for you, or is it just sort of tracking these things as part of license manager and reporting on it?
You are asking for a lot of information from a press release from Amazon at this moment. But it does say convert MS SQL license. You can easily convert Windows MS SQL BYOL to an AWS license using the Windows MS SQL license conversion action. And the launch process includes checking the SQL edition if it's enterprise standard or web, and using the right AMI with the right billing code.
I think what scares me more is the Windows Update version that they have an SSM runbook that will just do the upgrade for you. I feel like that definitely will never end well.
Yeah, upgrade Windows version. Yeah, what could go wrong? I'm going to go right from 2012 to 2022. Everything will be fine.
Yeah, no big deal.
Yeah, I can't imagine it'll go well.
I think migrating licenses is pretty handy because previously you couldn't get the SQL Server license without booting up one of their own AMIs. So being able to bring your own image in, I can't imagine why you'd want to do that versus migrating the data. But
well, again, this is the application migration service. So, I mean, it potentially is taking a backup of your SQL database on-prem, and then it's going to move it into one of their RDS, licensed options or EC2 licensed options. So, I mean, again, it's how much of it is doing. I mean, it says a post-launch action, but I don't actually know if it's actually post-launch or is it post sort of launch. So it's weird. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, in a feature that I thought they announced forever ago, ALBs have now support TLS 1.3. So this enables you to optimize the performance of your backend application servers while helping to keep your workload secure. TLS 1.3 on ALB works by offboarding encryption and decryption of TLS traffic from app servers to the load balancer. And TLS 1.3 is optimized for performance and security by using one round-trip TLS handshake and only supporting ciphers that provide perfect forward security.
I will submit the only reason I knew that this feature did not exist was about 2 months ago when the companies I advised for was like, we need to upgrade everything to TLS 1.3. And I was like, okay, just go update. And they, after like a half an hour of looking through documentation, I was like, oh, it's not supported here yet, but supported on CloudFront. So it's nice to see that they've now made this run in parity.
Yeah, you could at least have removed the insecure ciphers and ensured forward secrecy with TLS 1.2, but you don't get the advantage of the past handshake. So interesting it took so long.
It is interesting it took so long, especially considering, how much focus has been on security and particularly adoption of TLS 1.3 has been a pretty big industry push in general. So I'm surprised it's actually not come up in their SOC or ISO compliance as well. They probably just referred you to using NLB or something and said, that's how you solve it for now.
Mm-hmm. Or just, the regular elastic load balancer.
Yeah. The classic load balancer. Is that what they call it now?
Yeah.
The CLB?
CLB. Yeah. All right, let's move to GCP, who had nothing of interest this week because they're still trying to get Bard to work properly. But so they announced that the shared agenda for responsible AI progress because they failed to beat the market. So now they're going to try to regulate the market by telling you all the ways that they're trying to make AI progress to be more responsible. And so they talk about their AI experiments with Bard and tools like Palm and MakerSuite APIs, and the growing number of services across the entire AI ecosystem have sparked excitement about AI's transformative potential and concern about misuses. Google then goes into this article to talk about shared agenda for responsible AI progress and being one of the first people to publish anything around shared responsible AI in 2018 or 2008, even quite a ways away. They highlight one of the things to think about when you're thinking about the future for these tools is a simple thought experiment by James Manica at Google. It's the year 2050. AI has turned out to be hugely beneficial to society. What happened? What opportunities did we realize? And what problems did we solve? And then by taking that data, you can kind of then basically figure out what they think are the easy win opportunities that potentially could use responsible AI. And so they talk about being one of the first organizations to set those standards and now points to what they believe are required for any public AI policy, which number one is build on existing regulation, recognizing that many regulations that apply to privacy, safety, or other public purposes already apply fully to AI applications. That should continue to be adapted and addressed. Number two, adopt a proportion of risk-based framework focused on applications, recognizing that AI is a multi-purpose technology that calls for customized approaches and differentiated accountability among developers, deployers, and users. Promote an interoperable approach to AI standards and governance, recognize the need for internal alignment. Number four, ensure parity and expectations between non-AI and AI systems. Recognize that even imperfect AI systems can improve on existing processes, which means that the racist ones are not bad, folks. That's what they're saying. And then number five, promote transparency that facilitates accountability, empowering users, and building trust. So I mean, you had Azure fire their responsible AI people last week or the week before, I think, in the layoffs. So apparently Google thinks it's still important.
Yeah, the bot told them to fire the ethics people. And I think, for me at least, I think transparency is probably the most important one. I think if there's going to be any kind of guidance around the use of AI, and especially generative text, which is really what everyone's talking about right now, is that if you use it, you should declare that it was generated by a bot, or that you're just speaking to a bot and not a person, if it's a real chat. Because I think that will really have the opportunity to mess with people if they think they're speaking to a person, and it turns out they're not.
You mean every time I go to a website and I have to fight with them to get to human, it's not a human, it's a bot on the other end. I'm just yelling at them to like figure out why my return didn't work or my package didn't show up.
Yeah, in that case, it is actually a person. They're just being an ass.
You just found Ryan in customer support.
Yeah, I have one of two moves. I either fake a broken internet connection, or I'm sorry, the person you have tried to reach is no longer available.
You can't do driving through a tunnel anymore, Ryan.
Oh, I can. Just no one buys it, but I don't care.
Were you talking about Amazon returns specifically, Matt?
It varies. Whatever the wife has purchased that we need to return, or gifts from families for the baby that are too small, or 17 sizes too large. Those types of things.
Yeah, Amazon returns are kind of weird. Like sometimes it's so easy. You literally go there and click it. Maybe they want you to return it, maybe they don't. Other times it's, well, actually, you've got to click this help page here, and then you scroll down the page, and then can you find the link to talk to a person? No, they send you to someplace else. It's a real chore.
Yeah, it really depends on if it's a third-party seller or not, and a bunch of things that tie into that. But actually, interesting. I saw, it's not who we talk about the cloud pod normally, but since you brought it up, they're actually adding into items that are returned frequently. They're adding a notification into the Amazon store, so you can do extra due diligence to make sure what you're buying is what you think it should be, which is fine right now. It's like, that's nice, but then does that eventually end up impacting the return policy in the future? That would be kind of the question on that type of things, but interesting.
Well, like you bought something knowing that you might have to return it, and then you returned it.
Yeah,
it's going to cost you. Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Yeah, so I assume there's another shoe going to drop on that at some point, but right now they're just adding in the notification banner saying, "Hey, this item is regularly returned." So, that'd be interesting. It's interesting, with the prevalence of AI, in recent months now, I've been learning about all kinds of AI startups I never knew existed. So one this weekend I read about was Replika. You guys heard of this one? Mm-hmm. Apparently the AI companion who cares. And apparently replicas were designed by the founder to help her get over the death of someone close to her. And so they took their text messages and put them into an AI generative model. And then basically the bot sort of sounded like this person. But then that led into, you can have a virtual companion. And then, of course, because it's a virtual companion, that turns into sex. And then that was going to be a problem because they had to now protect the replicas from children. And then they decided that wasn't going to do, so they removed all of that. But apparently by doing that, they severed this human relationship that these people had established. And like, you could get married to your replica, like, and all these things, weird world of cyber internet culture that, you always get a little concerned about. But yeah, that's the whole thing. And, I didn't know it existed. And I probably never would have known it existed until, AI became a big thing. And I was reading about some companies. This is one that huge controversy because they removed the sexing feature. So there you go.
I'm sure something else will come along.
Sure, something else will. And now I have like a new experiment to try with Bard. I'm like, I didn't try that. I don't know how that works.
Isn't that like every sci-fi movie about like AI? Eventually, like,
everything on the internet always leads to sex and pornography because that's how growth happens, and those things apparently. So there you go. Let's move to Azure, shall we? So Microsoft is telling us that the odds are stacked against cybersecurity professionals, which I love to be caught up on my vendor, first of all. And too often, though, they fight an asymmetric battle against prolific, relentless, and sophisticated attackers. And so Microsoft is bringing the power of AI to security at their inaugural Microsoft Secure event, which marries security with the power of OpenAI's GPT-4 generative AI into the Microsoft Security Copilot. Microsoft says Copilot is the first security product to enable defenders to move at the speed and scale of AI. And Security Copilot combines the advanced large language model with the security-specific model of Microsoft. I'd say more about what this thing is, but there's so little in the announcement that they actually have a video that I thought would maybe help shed more light into what this actually is. And then I watched the video, which basically is a big search box where you can ask the dumbest security questions ever, like, what is log4j? And it gives you a summary description of what log4j is. And then like the next question was, does it impact Windows? So you could ask a follow-up question. And they go, of course it doesn't impact Windows because Windows doesn't run log4j, which is just not helpful. Now, if you could tell me like, what of my machines have a log4j vulnerability, that would be kind of cool and something useful. And so I've declared this as the biggest piece of vaporware BS I've ever fucking seen. So it is horrendous. And the fact that they're even trying to go out there and say this is a product is just ridiculous, Microsoft.
I can't get the image out of my head of like Clippy wearing a badge saying, "Would you like to open a Sev1 incident?" Because I just don't know like what they're expecting out of these things. I think this is a great opportunity. I mean, every security product for the last 10 years has been saying that they're modernizing an AI into their product, and it's all just been sort of regex. Yeah. And so like, I do think that there's a really good opportunity here, but it's, this isn't the way to go about it. Maybe Copilot for code, like in their GitHub product, right? For recommending more secure coding practices, maybe automated, security, queries generation, something like that. But this is terrible.
Yeah. I think it has potential. Like the idea is great. I'd love the idea of it, but just because you had a big partnership with OpenAI for billions of dollars doesn't mean every one of your products has to get AI in a bad way. Like, can you actually make it a workable product, something that I actually want to use before, we move into this world of, we're going to have BS AI products, because that's just not helpful. Shame on you, Microsoft.
I wish you well. I really hope that it gets developed and we no longer have to work with real InfoSec people.
I think the problem is I told my InfoSec people to listen to this cloud pod, so I should probably be careful what I say about them.
I mean, InfoSec people are great people. They do need more tooling. They do need more help. They are overworked. I agree with all those things, but this is just not the solution to help them.
What's actually interesting is the feature that you actually want of like, hey, what servers have the OpenSSL vulnerability that came out earlier this year or late last year / the other one this year, or some of these other things. Like I know in Azure, I had to go figure out in my infrastructure if any of these things, and Azure actually has some decent tools like running the Windows Defender agent, and it would go across my whole infrastructure, and they had it out there quickly and was able just to run a quick query to say, okay, these ones are exposed or have this vulnerability and these ones don't. So it's like they need to kind of marry, whatever they're doing over here with Copilot and, actually relate it to your infrastructure, not just like, hey, I am a junior person that just came out of college and is in InfoSec, which is what it sounds like the product is. I haven't played with it and just been like, okay, here you go. Like it needs to actually start to, tie things together, I feel like, to really be useful to, higher level people.
I really think its value is just a natural language interface to the data you already have. Because, I mean, scanning for vulnerabilities, those are very deterministic things. And once you've got the data, analyzing the data is a bit of a chore. So, if you can ask the Copilot a question in natural language to say, well, which of my servers have this version or which of my servers have this, it's just a way of report building using your voice instead of, crystal reports or, Tableau or anything else.
Well, which would be fine, right? Like if the insights were, had ML powered learning and you could do stuff like, trend the, remediation time of incidents and use that kind of thing. But it's not really quite AI. Like when I think about AI, it's generating, either query content or proactively, not only running the report, but drafting it. That's really what I want to see is these products sort of like, augment existing, security analysts and help them, in their environments.
Yeah, I guess you want it to be a little more proactive. You don't have to ask it questions. Do I have this vulnerability? Do I have that vulnerability? It's like, well, assess my system and tell me what you think. Like, give me...
Yeah, monitor the CVE, RSS feed and, proactively do a thing. Right? That's what I want.
Yeah, it could even be that you accept some level of risk for some versions of things, but you don't want it to be an excessive number of servers that run it, or particular use cases like internal only but not customer facing, or something like that. So, yeah.
Determine a risk score based on application exposure and functionality and a whole bunch of things that I don't know how you train the model to do that to customer specific workloads, but how cool would that be to be like, yeah, this isn't a big deal. Mm-hmm. The computer says it's fine. You
essentially need a individual company based risk assessment, and then from there, say, hey, look, these are how I rate A, B, C, D, and now go tell me, cool, this is a 7 on the CVE score, but now how do we actually make this, is this actually critical? Oh no, this vulnerability is on an internal worker node that just grabs files and processes it. The odds of it getting attacked in this other way that really isn't there, it probably is not a high criticality. So it doesn't need to be patched out of cycle.
Yeah, the key thing here on all of this is actually reminds me of an article I read on Monday from Steve Yegg, and we talked about Steve in the past here on the show. He's the guy who wrote the blog post about how terrible Google is at platforms versus Amazon, and he was at AWS early in their creation as well. But he's now a CTO or VP of engineering at SourceGraph. But he had a whole article called "Cheating Is All You Need." I just put it in the show notes, so it'll be there for those looking for it. But he actually talks about the need in ChatGPT, in all these GPT-4 and all these things, is how do you give it the hints about what you actually want or the context of it. And so he talks about about how their company actually does that, is one of the key ways to be able to provide as much data as possible to give you the right insights back. But it's interesting because that's what you're actually saying, is that you need more context in your AI model to actually provide the answers that we really want from a tool like Copilot. So this is a good article to read about kind of his perspective on it too, which I think is valid. I just didn't have a good way to put it into the main show notes to talk about, but you guys just gave it to me, so perfect. But yeah, it worked out really well. But it's a good article and worth reading through when you guys have some time later tonight. But he talks quite a bit about how do you solve this for coding assistants in particular, and the way to make a coding assistant better is to actually give it more of your code, so it can actually then build the model off of your code and then have context of variables and APIs and how you're passing data through them. And then it goes into how they have a product called Cody that helps you try to do this, which you can buy from them, of course, if you want to. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, little segue there.
I mean, that's how they're going to monetize AI, right? It's going to be that model customization, whether it's going to be more of a platform of model generation that's very specific, so that you can provide that context, and with allowing enough hooks to fetch public stuff where it doesn't get too biased in any one direction, probably. But it's going to be interesting to see how the market works all that out.
Yeah, for sure. All right, moving on to more talk about Microsoft Azure AI services. Microsoft is really on a roll again, Copilot, but they also had to tell you this week that Azure AI for the third week in a row is generally available, and this time it's available for ISVs. If you didn't think you could use it before, you can now. So Microsoft, too much. You're overplaying the hand. It's time to take a step back. Maybe during the Copilot thing and then this announcement, I was reading it and I was like, what? You guys announced Azure AI last week, and then it was like, oh, but for ISVs, and I was like, that is just shenanigans. Come on, guys. So, called it out. Calling you out, Microsoft, twice in one episode. That's terrible. That's a bad track record. You don't want that. That's Oracle level hate.
I had half of mine when reading the GCP thing that the only reason they were talking about the responsible AI and when they brought it out was just so they could remind everyone that they were first, right? Like,
but it did feel that way in the article. Like, just remind you, we came out with the first version of this in 2008. Like, okay, thanks.
Yeah, so it does seem like the hyperscalers are all sort of like trying to, stake their claim in the AI space.
Yep. Everyone's gonna have an AI feature this year, and they're all gonna be terrible, and they're gonna go through the trough of disillusionment, and everyone's gonna hate AI for a couple of years, and then they'll come out with really awesome solutions. Then all of a sudden we'll be back in love with it. I'm sure that's how these things cycle through. Well, I did find one actual announcement though from Azure this week. Matt, did you say something? Sorry.
I was gonna say it's just like all the Bitcoin announcements and blockchain announcements a couple of years ago. Everyone had to get one out the door, and I feel like I don't think I've heard anything about them in 3-4 years, something like that.
Well, I mean, the trough of disillusionment around Bitcoin is pretty low right now. I mean, you might have heard of a little company called FTX recently. So yeah, they're real bad, but it'll come back. It'll come back at some point.
Have you been waiting months and months to hire your new AWS, GCP, or Azure architect, only to have them be poached at the 11th hour by a startup with a juice bar? Initiatives stalled because you're having trouble hiring? Well, I have a simple solution: Foghorn Consulting. Foghorn Consulting provides top-notch cloud engineers to the world's most innovative companies and can be burning down your DevOps and cloud backlogs as soon as next week. Foghorn certified AWS, GCP, and Azure professionals are armed with infrastructure as code, and from day one will be designing performant, optimized cloud-native or hybrid environments that deliver on the promise of cloud. Their FogOps solution even provides on-demand cloud engineering to augment your existing teams. Visit www.foghornconsulting.com or send an email to cloudtalentnow@foghornconsulting.com and tell them the CloudPod sent you. Your dedicated FogOps team is with you for the long haul, and they bring their own juice.
All right. Well, I did find a real story from Azure. So they did actually announce something. They announced Azure Virtual Network Manager, or AVNM, because Microsoft loves their acronyms. AVNM works through a process of grouping, configuring, and deploying. You'll be able to group your network resources across subscriptions, regions, and even tenants, and configure the kind of connectivity and security you want among your grouped network resources. And finally, you can deploy those configurations of the network group in whichever and however many regions you would like, all through the new AVNM solution.
This is really just IAM, right? In sheep's clothing. Like if you can group these network things just so you can target them with permission policies. You can restrict, a subscription meant for only dev workloads to only use certain groups. And I mean, it's nice. It's a great way to sort of build your service catalog, if you will, of things and publish that as part of your infrastructure.
Yeah, but they have examples in here of like, hey, you can use it to force allowing traffic to and from monitoring services or domain controllers. Like, I see why you want to do that, but I also don't know that I want you to force that on people. So with great power comes great responsibility.
I mean, those are the decisions you have to make with the cloud. Yeah, as running a cloud platform, like you got to make that trade-off, right? Like, I don't want everyone to know how all the sausage is made and invent their own wheels. But at the same time, you don't also want to solve for all use cases and have one way to do things. It's tricky.
This feature actually is something that is interesting for me because we have our product launch in so many different countries due to different, country regulations, GDPR, UK, India is launching their own, data has to live locally policy shortly. So, this is interesting because one of the things I'm looking at doing is kind of retrofitting some of our environments and, stepping up some of the more network level security. We have decent, but I want to bring it to the next level. And something like this is something I can do, and then let developers go try to break everything they want and not let them, affect anything else.
Got it.
So, in general, how do you find networking with Azure as compared with AWS or GCP?
Some things are good, some things are not. Luckily, a lot of the base network was already laid down at my day job. The product's been there for a little while. Some of the things that I'm used to of the security groups and the NACLs all just fall into the NSG rules in Azure, or at least as far as I understand thus far. And I'm used to having kind of two levers as needed, even though I've never told a customer to ever use a NACL before. I'm still learning a little bit more about it. It's just nice that it all was there for me. And, I'm now dealing with kind of the higher level stuff in the application. I may kind of circle back to some of the infrastructure stuff at the, networking level later on, but it seems decent thus far. But with everything Azure, there's tiers of everything, which is always fun and confusing. And there's always that one feature you need that makes you have to go from the one that's like, a couple $100 a month to a couple $1,000 a month in the true Microsoft, methodology.
And next week on the podcast, Ultra Premium Matt will be showing up.
We charge extra for that.
Yeah.
And all it gets you is integration into your VNet.
Perfect. Sign me right up for that premium ultra networking AVM. All right. Well, Oracle is back this week again, and they're slinging mud once again, but this time only at AWS. Last week, we talked about them slinging mud at GCP, Azure, and AWS. But this time, they went after serverless. And guess what, guys? It saves more money on OCI. I know you're shocked.
Faster, better, cheaper, right?
Yeah. First, Oracle, in their comparison of serverless on AWS and serverless on Oracle, points out that they are not exactly identical. Bashing AWS for the fact that Lambda is proprietary and lock-in, of course, is number one move, where OCI functions are based on the open source project FN project, which means you can create portable applications that can easily be run in other clouds and on-premise environments. So first, that's the first strike against Lambda, is that it's a closed source. Second strike, their free tier is 2 million functions versus AWS Lambda's 1 million functions. And then, of course, they hit them for strike 3, which was region pricing bashing, because other regions are more expensive. But they did compare this one on US East 1 and OCI. And the first scenario they gave us, but the request per million are the same 20 cents per million. So I'm not really sure I care about the free tier being 20 cents versus 40 cents, personally, but that's important. But overall, they do show that their duration prices are 18% less than AWS. And they've given us 2 scenarios to take a look at. The first one is an image processing scenario with a use case. Function is triggered each time an image is uploaded to object storage. And let's say that they load 2 million images a month, and their 256 megabit function takes 90 seconds to run, which fails all of my API SLAs, but I don't know about yours. This works out to $743.53 for AWS and only $631.98 for OCI. Scenario B is a security system that collects temperature, vibration, and proximity sensor posts and updates them 50 million times a month, each time invoking a 1 gigabit function that takes half a second to run. And in that scenario, AWS was $419.80 and Oracle was $358.18. Apparently, both services offer a way to minimize cold starts, which I did not know about OCI. And OCI for that capability is also 18% cheaper than AWS. Again, this is nice. So you can save 18%, move your function to Oracle, or you could just buy Savings Plan, which would save you 17%, which is basically a wash. So I love Oracle leaving out the facts. Again, do your own research. Don't listen to Oracle for everything. But, again, nice to see a comparison. Just wish it was more factual.
I do find it funny, like the touting of the, we're open source and you can use this anywhere, where the only reason the open source project exists is because of Lambda.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, why does this thing exist in the world? Oh, because Lambda existed. Same thing with Knative. It's sort of the same thing. Like, well, that's because Lambda was a thing.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. And, I do think that there's some value in sort of standardizing on some primitives and allowing that sort of portability. But I also have never used one that touted that I didn't have to then also inject something specific to that platform. So I'm sure it's a YAML file because everything's a YAML file and you define things a certain way. And I bet you money there's at least some values when using the OCS or the OCI platform that are specific to that deployment, just through the nature of it. And so I don't get that, that claim when, it's true for any cloud managed version of anything.
Yeah, I don't personally care that it's not open source. It's a service that I consume through an API. Mm-hmm. It does a thing, and I pay for it, and if it breaks, they fix it.
Mm-hmm. It's
what more do you
implementation details of how I configure that, how I assign, memory and CPU resources and runtime attributes. If I define it in a YAML or CloudFormation, it just seems sort of not that valuable.
I'm also looking at their GitHub project, and I think the last time they have a release of the FN project /FN is 2019. So I guess my question is, how active is this project, or are they just leveraging, older technology, or have they forked it and now are, kind of making it be proprietary without, giving all those details?
There's not a lot to it, right? It's a container.
Yeah. I assume there would be some security update or something in the last 3.5 years.
Yeah.
So I'm just doing some quick Googling because I was trying to chase that down just because it was my question that popped in my head too. Like, where does this FN thing? Oracle owns it. They bought the project.
Of course they do.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. So yes, it's open source, but it's not really open source. Because I was like, why wouldn't they just use Knative? Like, what? This makes no sense to me. Why? Like this project I've never heard of. But yeah, FN is the fruit of Oracle's move to hire the team behind of Iron.io, which was who created FN. So they basically own it. So
Thank you for the research.
Yeah, you're welcome. Half-ass internet research in 5 seconds. There you go. All right, well, let's move on to our Cloud Journey series, which Matthew comes in cold to. So last week we kicked off our latest version of it, which is all about cloud native and cloud native patterns. And so last week we kind of did a deep dive on what is cloud native, what makes it special, why do you care about it, etc. And this time we're going to dive deep into microservices and containers, because the first thing you should know is that to be cloud native, you don't have to be in a container, nor do you have to be a microservice, but they do help. So first of all, what are microservices and how do they differ from monolithic architecture? Who wants to start?
I can start. So I think we're going to have contentious arguments about microservices like we did last week again. I don't know.
I think so. But I'm geared up for war now.
For me, at least, I mean, the idea of microservices is more of an architectural style of building a service whereby you deploy or you create small applications independent of each other, independent services that communicate with each other through well-defined APIs. Each microservice has a very specific business purpose, and they can be deployed and scaled independently of all the others.
All right, fine, I agree.
I agree, but I also think that a microservice doesn't have to be extremely specific. So some people will say a microservice is like, hey, here's a piece of data and it returns it. I also think a microservice can just be, hey, this is my API layer. And it's completely isolated from the front end and back end. And while it's not a true or, as tight and as small as a microservice, can be like a smaller layer inside of a multi-layered environment. So to me that maybe that's a middle layer somewhere between a microservice and a monolithic, but to me that is a type of microservice. It, like you said, really to me is the second half. It's an isolated piece of your infrastructure that can be built independent and deployed independent of everything else, scaled, monitored, etc.
It's more fun when we disagree.
Well, I mean, I kind of, it's one of those things where it's on a spectrum, right? I've seen people do microservices that are just really sort of extending a monolith, and I've seen people do microservices that are basically a function wrapped up in an API that just does some ETL on a JSON string and returns it. And it's just like, well, why? There are limits to the ends of the spectrum, and there are pros and cons of choosing, and you have to sort of figure out your architecture based on those requirements, right? The scaling, the blast radius, the ownership, that sort of thing. And it's there's not going to be a right answer or one answer there.
So you're saying is that microservices could be helpful, but do they need to be in containers to be helpful as a microservice? Or do you think that's an area where there's some flexibility?
I'll start.
Yeah.
I think no. I don't think they need to be. I mean, you could have a microservice, one that runs on a PaaS. In theory, you could just have an API layer or a single API that runs in Beanstalk or Azure App Services. It's still a thing. It's just not in a container. It's its own isolated thing. You, in theory, could even have a microservice, maybe if you need enough compute or something along those lines, that runs on 10,000 servers that scale up and down. But it still kind of meets that qualification that Jonathan said of, it can scale independently, is independent of everything else. So sure, it's great if it's on a container and it has other advantages and other disadvantages if it's on a container, but definitely doesn't have to be on a container.
Yeah, I mean, I think we as an industry, we've sort of forgotten that containers were really made to make it easier to package and deliver software. They're not really necessary for anything else. And then we added Kubernetes to it, and then everything became monolithic inside Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is the new monolith. in many ways. But it definitely, there's people who are very religious about this, that microservices have to be microservices, monolithic is dead, and if it's a microservice, then you must be in containers to get acceleration of innovation, and that's the path that a lot of people tout. And I know I've said those words before too, so even I've said it, but not because I believe that containers are required for it. It's really more about fixing CI/CD at the end of the day.
And the containers do help for that, but like you said, it's really delivering the artifact and getting that single thing out there and functional. And that single piece is what is the microservice. And it might just be a zip file you deploy to, a service, and that service handles it all for you. And probably behind the scenes, they're running it in a container. But, again, it's all just a thing that is deployed.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think anything about the definition of a microservice doesn't mean that it can't be, a load balancer fronted by a compute instance that's accessing a database. I think the important part is that, it's defining its boundaries, it's defining its construction, and it is able to scale and move and be developed independently of its integration, external dependencies. Right? Because I think that's really the important part that people often miss. Like when we think about why we're doing something else besides the monolith, right? It's because, it required coordination of 9 teams to get a simple API version, changed, because it was using a DLL run by this team, which is imported by this other team. And, this other team is in the flow, and it's all in one giant repo, and it's all just one build. And we can only release twice a year. And it's so containers are often confused with that because they CI/CD allows a lot of speed, but they're really, I in a lot of ways think of containers more as package management than a runtime, because I see a lot more advantages at that layer.
I mean, resource utilization has always been sort of touted as one of the benefits of containers, though, because you can pack these containers in to a few number of nodes. And it sort of magically saves you, 50 cents on your bill at the end of the month. Do you think that's a reasonable kind of selling point, or not so much really at scale?
I think it depends on how much you own the own destiny. If you're, managing the Kubernetes platform itself, are you saving any money? No, you're still running that, right? Are you shifting? If you're a developer team who's, running a workload on a provided Kubernetes cluster, you're shifting the responsibility to that team. That's great. And so I think it really depends on how you do it. And I think it's also where a lot of teams hang themselves out to dry too, is because it's like, oh, well, we don't have to really consider the resource constraints, of how these things are doing it. And so, it's all fine and good until you have a noisy neighbor within your cluster that's using up all the CPU. And now those weights that you sort of just defaulted or glanced over when you deployed your service are super important. And so it's just moving a lot of the same things around. We've been thin provisioning VMs for ages, right? It's no different. And so it's just, another arose by another name, I guess.
Maybe, perhaps. It's just one of those interesting concepts, right? So thinking about, microservices and containers, what were the advantages of using them in a cloud native architecture, in particular, tying it back to our series?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it was the, moving away from the monolith really to take advantage and make that make sense was CI/CD, right? And the container story for CI/CD has always been very tightly intertwined. It's for a developer, they can develop that Docker container locally, they can push that through a pipeline and get it all the way into the production. And so I really do think that it takes advantage of all those, of a lot of the deploy and maintenance of a microservice. And then, cloud native, all the cloud hypervisors are geared towards supporting those technologies, right? Everyone has their own container platform or their ability to sort of manage that. It's very common these days. And even a migration path where you containerize it in your data center and then move it into the cloud, right? Because you're sort of packaging it up in a cloud native way, right? There's a lot of overlap in that story.
I think scale to zero or very close to zero is a pretty big advantage. overnight. If you have very sort of time-based or predictable usage patterns, you can scale to almost costing you nothing when you're not really doing your core business hours.
So thinking about this path, like how would you approach this? What tools would you leverage? How would you think about CI/CD for these microservices and containers, and then moving that into that cloud native architecture? How does it all stitch together? How do we piece that together for our listeners?
Well, I think me and Jonathan still have to arm wrestle on what we think cloud native actually is, right? So it's hard until that battle royale is addressed. I don't know. But I do think that it's important to just look at the business advantages you're trying to achieve, right? Like it's all fine and good to play with a new shiny tool. That's a lot of fun. I spend the majority of my time doing that. But it doesn't mean much, and it won't really be adopted if you can't make sense to the business. So are you trying to gain velocity? Are you trying to achieve cost savings? Are you trying to, put out a better product and shorten your iteration time? And, there's a lot of different tools, that have differing levels of entry level pain to do that, right? It's, it's really easy to run Docker and just, expose that natively. You can even run that as part of your, just directly on your compute node a lot of ways. And so if your CI/CD is your main goal, maybe that's an option if you already have that ecosystem. Everyone's choosing Kubernetes because, it's the new hotness. It's not so new anymore.
I mean, it's still everybody's fanboy of Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everybody, every project I ever hear is like, what about Kubernetes? And it's like, oh, yeah. Okay.
Still the solve all, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then once you get it, then they want Istio and service mesh, and then they want, something else, and then they want stateful data. Then they want to run SQL Server on top of Kubernetes, which I desperately want to do, and you guys all don't want to do. So
no, sweet God, no. Please stop recommending that.
I would say I died a little bit on the inside, but I've had to talk people out of that, of running stateful SQL databases on top of Kubernetes more times than I care to count.
Can you start with him? Like,
which one's him? Hold on.
Justice brings it up like once a quarter. Hey, what about this idea? And all of us are just look at him and glare now.
Next week we'll just have an intervention. Never mind the news story. The news stories.
Why is this a terrible idea? No, I acknowledge that it's probably not a great idea, but
we're gonna have to try it just because otherwise,
like once I see it fails in horrible fire, like it was like Windows containers. Like we all sort of like, well, we could try it. And then we try it and we're like, this is bad. We should not do this.
Why? Because it takes like an hour on AWS to boot up a ECS cluster just for a hello world and, IIS site versus like 10 minutes on, Linux and Nginx. I don't have any scar tissue around that one.
Worked really good though.
Yeah, like Ryan said originally, to go back to the question, I mean, really it's what are you trying to, what are you trying to do? What's the business objective here? Do you want microservices and containers, I feel like kind of get used interchangeably, but they're not really things that are interchangeable in my head. One is a tool that helps you achieve the other. So, containers help you achieve, or let me rephrase that. Containers can help you achieve microservices if you don't, build a full monolith in a container, which definitely no one has ever done before. And really it's what you're trying to achieve here, like, and how do you want to achieve it? Do you want to, if you are taking a monolithic and, starting your journey to split it apart, do you want to go containers? Okay, cool. Then there's, all the container tools that, about Docker, Podman, Kubernetes, whatever you want to actually make it work. Or do you want to just go to a PaaS product and potentially, pay the cloud provider to help you with some of these things and just give them zip files of your, application and be able to run these things? Or is it a Lambda and just here's my Lambda, here's my zip file, go run it for me, in whatever the cloud that you're running it, so it really, you have to look at like what you're trying to achieve and then what the skill set of the employees of the company are in order to actually figure out how to do it. So like, it'd be great. I remember a conversation I had years ago with like, hey, if you could build something, straight up brand new with, whatever you want, what's the best thing, I asked one of my coworkers at the time, and their response was, well, it varies. After years of doing this, I fully understand why the answer is it varies, because it just depends what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to achieve just, hey, go run this thing and we're not going to update it? It's going to probably be something fairly static. Or is it something that we want to iterate over quickly and we're going to have 30 developers working on it? And how do we build out, a proper workflow for all these things? So, it would be great if there was a silver bullet, but then, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably.
I will say that if, in that latter scenario, if I get the chance to do that again, I am going to choose a much more declarative solution rather than freeform, like something that, OpenShift or Harness or Argo CD, like something that is very like, this is your entry point. This is how you develop on this thing. This is how you promote it to the next level. This is how you have to name it. And here's your fancy UI that lets you see your entire production pipeline. Just because one of the mistakes I've made in the past is to sort of underestimate people's understanding or translation of, do we have a meeting on the minds on what continuous delivery is and what we're trying to achieve with that? And it's something that I've found is easy to have what seems like an agreement, and then the details, it gets lost, and it's sort of a challenge.
I guess that's kind of the difference between just having a bunch of tools available to use and having a coherent platform, and and a strategy and how this is how you use it and this is our offering. It's great to say here's Kubernetes, have at it, and that's been a huge problem for years. But actually, productionizing Kubernetes in general is very difficult.
And there are different concerns, right? Running a very sophisticated application in production, nice catch, is a different concern for deployment velocity. And, I think there's different patterns for that. And I think there's room within an organization for both.
Well, great. Next week, we're going to talk more about Kubernetes. Or maybe we'll do something else. We'll talk about it later. But because we did cover Kubernetes a couple of times tonight. But Matthew's microphone's giving up the ghost. So I think it's a good time to wrap up.
I was trying to look. I was talking with one of my old employees a few weeks ago. He moved to a new company and was working on, I can't remember the name of the platform that he helped build. I wanted to say it was called Backplane, which was his whole, he was developing a platform for his company where, hey, you just literally give it the repo, you put a couple of these files in there, and it will automatically build the Argo CD pipeline for the container deployment to dev, with all the gates and controls and everything. And I believe the technology was Backplane, but I'm not 100% sure. And turns out trying to type when you're talking around a microphone can be difficult at times. So.
All good. Well, thanks, guys. We'll talk to you all next week here on the Cloud Pod. Thanks, Matt.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
And that is the Week in Cloud. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Foghorn Consulting. Subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and tweet us your feedback at #TheCloudPod. Or join our Slack channel. Go to our website, thecloudpod.net for sign-up instructions.